For more than 4 decades, Vince Gill has occupied a strange kind of space in country music. He is one of the most decorated artists the genre has ever produced, a member of the Country Music Hall of Fame, the Grand Ole Opry, and a Nashville institution whose guitar playing and tenor voice are studied by younger musicians the way jazz players study old recordings. And yet, for all the trophies, he has also spent the last several years living through something that has nothing to do with charts or awards. Watching his wife, Christian pop icon Amy Grant, move through one serious health crisis after another. This is not a story built on speculation about a man secretly falling apart behind a calm public face. It's a story that Gill and Grant have told, in their own words, in interviews across the past several years, about a heart defect no one knew was there, a bike accident that nearly cost Grant her life, and a marriage that has had to absorb all of it in real time. Vincent Grant Gill was born in Norman, Oklahoma, the son of a federal judge who played banjo and a mother who played harmonica, and music was part of the household from the start. As a teenager, he played in a bluegrass band called Mountain Smoke, which was good enough to open a show for Pure Prairie League, the band he would eventually front. After graduating high school in 1975, Gill moved to Louisville, Kentucky, to join the Bluegrass Alliance, then spent a short stretch playing with Ricky Skaggs in the band Boone Creek before heading west to Los Angeles, where he joined fiddler Byron Berlin's group, Sundance. It was in Los Angeles, almost by accident, that his career took its first real turn. In 1979, Gill tagged along with a friend to an audition for Pure Prairie League, mostly out of curiosity about whether anyone in the band remembered his old high school group. They ended up hiring him as their new lead singer. He appeared on 3 of the band's albums and sang lead on their hit, Let Me Love You Tonight, which reached the pop top 10 and gave him his first real national exposure. But Pure Prairie League's momentum was already fading by the time he joined, and after a few years he made a decision that looked, on paper, like a step backward. He left a band with a record deal to become a sideman again, this time in Rodney Crowell's backing group, the Cherry Bombs. That decision turned out to matter more than almost anything else in his early career. In the Cherry Bombs, Gill played alongside keyboardist Tony Brown and bassist Emery Gordy Jr., 2 musicians who would go on to shape the sound of Nashville as producers and label executives. As the Cherry Bombs, the group spent those years backing Rodney Crowell and his then-wife Roseanne Cash on the road and in the studio, which is also where Gill first built the working relationships with Cash and Crowell that would lead to session and songwriting opportunities throughout the following decade. The friendships he built in that band led directly to his solo deal. First with RCA in 1983, where Gordy produced his early records, and later with MCA, where Brown had become a producer and executive. Before any of that, though, Gill and his young family had to relocate to Nashville and start over on modest footing. He moved there in 1984 with his first wife, Janice Oliver, and their toddler daughter, and by most accounts of that period, they were doing it on a shoestring. Those RCA years, which included his 1984 debut mini-album Turn Me Loose, earned him respect inside the industry, but only modest commercial success. He spent time playing small rooms like Nashville's Bluebird Cafe, sharpening his songwriting rather than chasing radio hits, and by his own account, he wasn't always confident in his own voice, something producers sometimes worked around by keeping the instrumentation up front in the mix. He released 3 albums on RCA across the mid-1980s, none of which broke him into the upper tier of country radio. And by the end of the decade, he had moved to MCA, still searching for the sound that would finally match his ability. The real turning point came in 1989, when Gill signed with MCA and reunited with Tony Brown, who made a deliberate choice to put Gill's voice at the center of the recordings rather than treating it as one more instrument in the arrangement. The resulting album, When I Call Your Name, sold more than 1 million copies, and the title track won Single of the Year at the CMA Awards. It was the moment the industry stopped thinking of Vince Gill as a talented sideman and started thinking of him as a star in his own right. What followed was one of the most decorated runs in country music history. Gill joined the Grand Ole Opry in August 1991. Through the 1990s, he released a string of hit albums, Pocket Full of Gold, I Still Believe in You, When Love Finds You, and became the rare artist who could dominate both the singles charts and the awards shows at the same time. He won the CMA's Entertainer of the Year award in back-to-back years, 1993 and 1994, and took home a Grammy for male country vocal performance in nearly every year between 1989 and 1997. He also became a fixture as the CMA Awards host from 1992 to 2003, a role that made him one of the most recognizable and well-liked figures in Nashville, on top of one of its most awarded. As of 2020, he had won 21 Grammy Awards across categories that included singing, songwriting, producing, and instrumental performance, a body of work that eventually earned him induction into the Country Music Hall of Fame, the Musicians Hall of Fame, and the Nashville Songwriters Hall of Fame. Even at the height of his solo fame, Gill never fully stepped away from the session work that had shaped his early years in Los Angeles. He remained one of the most in-demand harmony vocalists and guitarists in Nashville, lending his playing and singing to records by Emmylou Harris, Reba McEntire, Bonnie Raitt, Dire Straits, and his old Cherry Bombs bandmate Rosanne Cash, among many others. That reputation as a musician's musician, someone other artists wanted in the room, not just on the marquee, became as central to his identity as his own chart success. It's also part of why one of his best-known songs carries more weight than a typical radio hit. Go Rest High on That Mountain, which he began writing after the 1989 death of his friend and fellow singer Keith Whitley, and finished years later following the death of his own brother, has become one of the most widely requested songs at funerals and memorial services in the genre. A piece of writing that fans and critics alike often point to as the clearest example of how Gill turned personal grief directly into some of his most enduring work. Behind the string of hits, Gill's personal life was going through its own transition. He had married Janice Oliver, one half of the harmony duo Sweethearts of the Rodeo, in 1980, and the couple had a daughter, Jenny, in 1982. They had known each other since the mid-1970s, when both were young musicians working the Southern California bluegrass circuit, and their marriage held together through the lean years before either of them found real commercial success. By the mid-1990s, though, the marriage had run its course. Both Gill and Oliver had spent the intervening years building demanding careers of their own. Gill is one of the biggest touring and recording artists in the country, Oliver as one half of Sweethearts of the Rodeo, a duo with its own recording and touring obligations. And by most public accounts, the two simply grew apart over the course of nearly 2 decades spent largely on the road. Gill and Oliver divorced, with the split becoming final in the late 1990s after roughly 17 years together. Public reporting on the divorce has focused mostly on the practical outcome. Oliver retained the family's Tennessee horse property in the settlement, rather than on the private reasons the marriage ended, and neither Gill nor Oliver has spoken in detail publicly about what went wrong. What is well documented is the timing. Reports of a close friendship, and later a romantic relationship, between Gill and singer Amy Grant began circulating before either of their marriages had formally ended, and that overlap made the split a subject of tabloid speculation for a period in the late 1990s. Both Gill and Grant have said in later interviews that nothing physical happened between them while they were still married to their previous spouses, even as they acknowledged there was an undeniable connection. Gill and Grant's actual history goes back much further than the tabloid version suggests. Gill has said that he first took notice of Grant's voice in 1983 when he heard her holiday song, Tennessee Christmas, on the radio while driving around Nashville, and pulled his car over to listen. The two didn't meet in person and become close, however, until 1993, when both were working in the Nashville music scene. Gill still married to Oliver, Grant still married to musician and television host Gary Chapman, with whom she had 3 children. By the time both marriages had ended, Gill's divorce from Oliver finalized around 1997 to 1998. Grant's divorce from Chapman finalized in 1999. Gill and Grant began dating openly. They married in March 2000, blending 2 families that included Gill's daughter Jenny and Grant's 3 children, Matt, Sarah, and Millie. Grant has said publicly that merging the 2 families wasn't easy in the early going. Recalling their wedding day in a later television interview, she joked that most of the photographs from that day showed grim-faced children who needed time to adjust. The couple's daughter together, Karina Grant Gill, was born in 2001, 2 days after their first wedding anniversary, and her arrival is often described by the family as the moment that pulled the blended household fully together. Gill and Grant have now been married for more than 2 decades, and in interviews around their anniversaries, Both have described the relationship less as something they planned and more as something that kept finding its way back together despite the odds. It's worth pausing on who Amy Grant was before any of this, because the story of the last several years only makes sense against the backdrop of what she'd already built. Grant recorded her first album at 15 and signed with Word Records just before her 16th birthday, becoming one of the defining voices of contemporary Christian music in the late 1970s and early 1980s. Her 1982 album Age to Age became the first Christian album by a solo artist to be certified platinum, and songs like El Shaddai turned her into a genre-defining figure well before most mainstream listeners knew her name. She crossed over into pop music gradually and, at the time, controversially. 1985's Unguarded and its single Find a Way drew criticism from some corners of the Christian music world who felt she should stay in her lane, and her 1986 duet with Peter Cetera, The Next Time I Fall, which hit #1 on the Billboard Hot 100, pulled her further into the mainstream. That crossover was cemented in 1991 with Heart in Motion, her biggest album by far, which sold more than 5 million copies in the United States and produced the #1 pop hit, Baby Baby, along with Every Heartbeat, That's What Love Is For, and I Will Remember You. Across her career, she has won 6 Grammy Awards and more than 20 Dove Awards from the Gospel Music Association, sold over 30 million albums worldwide, and become widely known as the Queen of Christian Pop, a title that reflects just how unusual her path was, moving between 2 different musical worlds that didn't always welcome that kind of crossing over. She has also carried a title that few artists in any genre can claim, Pioneer. Long before crossover was a familiar concept in Christian music, Grant was one of the first gospel artists to move into mainstream pop radio, a path that required her to absorb criticism from both directions. Some Christian audiences felt she'd strayed too far from her roots, while some mainstream critics were skeptical of an artist whose career began in church basements and Christian bookstores. Her 1988 album, Lead Me On, is still regarded by some music writers within the contemporary Christian genre as one of the finest records the format has ever produced, even though it came out just before her commercial breakthrough into the pop mainstream. That willingness to occupy an uncomfortable middle ground between 2 audiences, neither of which fully claimed her, is part of what made her later reputation as an elder stateswoman of both Christian and pop music possible. By the time she and Gill married in 2000, both of them were already among the most decorated artists in their respective genres, which is part of what makes the last several years notable. This isn't a story about an ordinary couple facing ordinary health scares, but about 2 people who had spent their whole adult lives building public careers around their voices, suddenly forced to navigate crises that threatened, quite literally, the instruments both of them had built everything on. The chain of health events that has defined the last several years of the couple's life together began, almost ironically, with a checkup that was supposed to be about Vince Gill, not Amy Grant. In December 2019, Gill went in for a routine cardiology visit after experiencing some shortness of breath, the kind of thing many people in their 60s simply write off. When the results came back, his doctor, John Bright Cage, delivered good news with a bit of humor. Gill later recounted the exchange to People magazine, recalling that the doctor told him his heart was fantastic and that he was simply fat and out of shape. It could have ended there. Instead, the doctor turned to Grant, who had accompanied her husband to the appointment, and suggested she get checked out too, citing her family's history of heart problems. Grant pushed back at first. She felt completely fine and, by her own account, assumed she was doing the doctor a favor by even agreeing to the tests. She scheduled the appointment for the first week of January 2020. The results came back showing everything was fine. Then, the next morning, she got a second message from her doctor telling her to call him right away. The tests had revealed that Grant was living with partial anomalous pulmonary venous return, or PAPVR, a rare congenital heart defect, present since birth, in which blood vessels that should carry oxygen-rich blood from the lungs are instead connected to the wrong part of the heart. It's a condition that affects less than 1% of the population, and Grant later said her cardiologist put the risk to her in blunt terms. Without treatment, the condition would eventually become catastrophic. There was no real option besides surgery, and not a minor procedure. Open heart surgery, the kind that resets a person's entire sense of what normal means. Grant underwent open-heart surgery in June 2020, in the early months of the COVID-19 pandemic, a timing that added its own layer of difficulty. Hospital visitation was tightly restricted that spring and summer, and Gill was not permitted to be in the building during his wife's surgery. For a man whose entire adult life had revolved around being present, on stage, in the studio, at home, that forced absence was its own kind of ordeal. He later described having to leave the hospital and simply wait for news, with no ability to be physically present for one of the most serious moments either of them had faced. When he was finally allowed into her recovery room, Grant was still coming out of anesthesia. Gill has described that moment in interviews since, saying that seeing her lying there, peaceful, was enough to tell him everything he needed to know, that she had made it through, and that she was going to be fine. Because so much of his own schedule had already been cleared by pandemic shutdowns, Gill was able to devote himself almost entirely to her recovery in the weeks that followed, something he has since said gave him a front-row view of how she handled adversity, meeting each stage of recovery, in his words, with kindness and grace, tackling one hurdle and then moving to the next. Grant herself has spoken extensively about the surgery in the years since, using her platform to encourage other women to take heart health screenings seriously. She has said she'd noticed for years that she got short of breath more easily than seemed normal, sometimes telling her husband she felt like she was suffocating even while breathing as deeply as she could, without ever connecting it to a heart problem. Doctors later told her that if the defect had gone undiagnosed, it likely would have proven fatal by her early 60s. She has since called the discovery, mundane as its origin was, a piece of extraordinarily good luck. In a 2023 interview looking back on the surgery, Grant described the recovery in strikingly physical terms, saying that once the operation was done, breathing itself simply felt more efficient than it ever had before, as if a lifelong limitation she'd never fully recognized had just been switched off. She has said she was back to taking long hikes within about 6 weeks of the operation, something she described as almost strange given the scale of what she'd just been through. Looking back on nearly 2 decades of unexplained breathlessness that she'd simply built her whole understanding of her own body around, she has said the whole experience left her more convinced than ever of the value of routine screening, especially for people who, like her, feel perfectly fine and see no reason to get checked. Grant recovered fully from the heart surgery, and by 2022 she was back to a normal, active life, including cycling, something she did regularly. In July of that year, she was out on her bike when she hit a pothole and crashed. Even though she was wearing a helmet, the fall was serious enough to knock her unconscious, and she was hospitalized with what doctors determined was a traumatic brain injury, along with cuts and bruises from the impact. Gill's response was immediate. He canceled a set of concerts scheduled for the following weekend and went straight to her side. The next week, he did keep a previously booked 4-night residency at Nashville's historic Ryman Auditorium, close to the couple's home, but by his own account his wife's recovery was very much on his mind throughout those shows. During one of those performances, he told the audience that Grant was improving every day, then brought the couple's daughter, Karina, then 21, on stage to perform When My Amy Prays, a song Gill had written for his wife, and which had won him a Grammy for Best Country Solo Performance the year before. Karina reportedly changed the lyric in the moment, singing When My Mama Prays instead. Unlike the heart surgery, which had a defined procedure and a fairly predictable recovery arc, the brain injury came with no clear timeline at all. There was no single operation that fixed the problem. Instead, Grant faced weeks and then months of uncertainty about how much of her prior functioning would return and when. The brain injury forced Grant to cancel her touring schedule for the rest of that year, and the recovery proved to be much harder and much less predictable than the heart surgery had been. In a January 2023 interview with People, Grant was candid about how difficult that period was emotionally as well as physically. She described it as really depressing, saying that with everything canceled, she found herself wondering whether she would ever be all the way back to who she'd been before. She has since said that Gill offered her a simple piece of steadying counsel during that time, that difficult things happen to people every day, that she needed to take it one day at a time, and that he and their family were there for her. She has credited that kind of steady, unfussy support with making the recovery bearable day to day. The bike accident wasn't the last health challenge the couple faced. The following year, Grant needed surgery to remove a cyst from her throat, a procedure that, for a singer whose entire career and identity is built around her voice, carried its own emotional weight separate from the physical recovery. She has said publicly that the surgery required her to essentially relearn how to sing, working to rebuild control and strength in her voice from the ground up. She has since said her voice felt better than it had in years once the recovery was complete. Grant has also undergone shoulder surgery in the years since the bike accident, adding one more item to what both she and Gill have described, without exaggeration, as a long and exhausting string of medical issues arriving one after another. One of the more lasting effects of the 2022 brain injury has been some ongoing memory loss, something both Grant and Gill have spoken about openly rather than tried to hide. In a joint interview with People in late 2024, marking the couple's approaching 25th wedding anniversary, Grant was asked to reminisce about the earliest days of their relationship. She acknowledged that her memory of that period is fuzzy, a direct, later effect of the accident. Rather than let the moment sit awkwardly, Gill stepped in immediately, explaining to the interviewer that Grant had been in a bike accident and then simply answering the question himself, filling in details she couldn't fully recall. He described the dynamic that's developed between them good-naturedly, calling it a tag team, comparing the way they cover for each other to a pair of championship tag team wrestlers. It's a small moment, but a telling one. Rather than treating her memory gaps as something to work around quietly or hide from an interviewer, the couple has folded it into how they talk about their life together, publicly and without apparent embarrassment. Grant herself has reflected on how the accumulation of health scares has changed her outlook rather than diminished it. Speaking to a regional newspaper in early 2023 ahead of a benefit concert for a heart health foundation, she described life since 2020 as something like surfing a tsunami, saying the key was staying flexible no matter what came next. She said that despite everything, she felt stronger and was singing better in her 60s than she expected to at that stage of her life, calling the recovery process an unexpected gift rather than purely a setback. Gill has been fairly direct, in the interviews he and Grant have given jointly, about what it's meant to be the steady presence through all of this. Describing the run of medical issues to People in 2024, he summed it up simply. It was just one thing after another after another. He's also been clear that he doesn't experience that role as a burden he resents. In the same interview, he said that watching Grant handle every setback with kindness and grace left him with even more respect for her than he already had. Grant, for her part, has said she relies on her husband's steadiness in ways that are so constant she barely notices them anymore, telling People, "I don't know all the ways I lean on him. I'm not even aware of it because it's second nature." She's also described a quiet exchange the two of them had during one of her recoveries, when Gill wondered aloud whether they'd be all right if it were ever just the two of them, with everything else in their lives stripped away. Her memory of his answer, "We'd be just fine," is one of the clearest things she says she remembers from that whole stretch of years, despite the gaps the accident left elsewhere. None of this has stopped Gill's career. He has continued to record, tour, and perform through the years his wife has spent recovering from one procedure after another, and in November 2025 he was set to receive the CMA's Willie Nelson Lifetime Achievement Award, one more honor added to a resume that already includes dozens of CMA and Grammy trophies, membership in the Grand Ole Opry, and multiple Hall of Fame inductions. Publicly, at least, very little about his Kate's. Part of what makes the last several years distinct from an ordinary story of illness and recovery is how public a family Gill and Grant lead, and how much of this has played out with their children nearby. Gill's daughter Jenny, born in 1982, grew up largely in the years before her father's marriage to Grant, and has since built her own music career, releasing original songs while also being candid in interviews about the pressure of following two well-known parents. Grant's 3 children from her first marriage, Matt, Sarah, and Millie, were teenagers or young adults by the time Grant and Gill wed in 2000, and Grant has spoken openly about how difficult it was to merge two households that hadn't chosen each other, describing the